You're listening to Margins and Meaning with John Wilson. Margins and Meaning accepts zero responsibility for remakes, fractures, delaminations, gray low-value anterior restorations, chameleon effects that were not charming, full arch cases that were built on the same ingot you use for a single lower molar because, hey, it worked last time, or any restoration that looks stunning on the bench and humbling in the mouth. Anything I say on this show is just my opinion. It's not gospel. It's not CE. It's not legal advice. And it definitely will induce emotional damage. If you ever handed a full arch restorative case to a clinician that thinks bonding is something you do with your children on the weekends, if you've ever been in this trade for more than 5 years and you're still selecting materials like you would off of a menu, well, this one's for you. Pull up a chair, but listen at your own risk. Thank you. Welcome back to Margins and Meaning. I'm John Wilson, and this is episode 16. I'm so glad you're here. I wanted to start today with a simple truth that nobody in this trade would ever argue with, and then I want to show you exactly how often we actually ignore it. You know, every restoration we make has two full-on jobs. The first job is to look right, be aesthetic, natural, invisible in the face, the kind of results that make a patient look in the mirror and stop really thinking about their teeth. The second job is to last, to function, to survive the forces of a real human mouth, the clenching, the grinding, the coffee. How about just life? And still be there a decade from now doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And you know what? Those two jobs have been in tension with each other for as long as this trade has existed. The materials that look the best have historically been the most fragile. The materials that last the longest have historically looked the worst. And the promise that has been made over and over in every generation of the material science is that the next product will finally resolve that tension. That the next evolution will give us something strong enough and beautiful enough to do both jobs every single time. That promise is real. The science has moved. The materials we have today are genuinely remarkable compared to what I was working with when I started. But that promise has also created something dangerous. It's created this idea that material selection is simple. You just look at the case and you pick the right product off a list, and somehow that material is going to do the rest. That the decision lives on a menu, and all you have to do is just order it correctly. And here's the truth. That idea is wrong. And today I want to tell you why. Not from a textbook, from a case that cost me more than I expected, and really taught me more than I deserved. I've been using IPS e.max for close to 20 years. I got into it right when this product came out. And guys, if you work in this trade and you don't know what that product is, I'm going to give you a short little version of it. Lithium disilicate glass ceramic. It's an exceptional product, exceptional aesthetics, exceptional clinical studies. One of the most documented materials in modern restorative dentistry in terms of its longevity data. Over those 20 years, the formulation improved constantly. The ingot choices expanded, the strength increased, the optical properties just evolved. It became a product I truly trusted deeply, a product I was really proud to implement and use in my laboratory. But here's what I know now that I didn't know then. You know, trust in a material is not the same as understanding when the case actually supports it. When I started working with e.max, the vast majority of our production in the laboratory was still metal ceramics, PFMs, the workhorse, the king of the crown for most of my career. You know, we were doing e.max on single units, anteriors mostly, some premolars, and the results were just beautiful. The material has what I call that chameleon effect. It absorbs the color from the surrounding environment. It really blends on that fashion, and on single units surrounded by natural dentition, it disappears in the mouth in a way that almost feels like magic. So I was proud of those cases. I was building confidence with the material, and at some point, the way momentum works when things are going well, I started to believe that confidence would somehow translate into readiness for something bigger. Well, it didn't. I had old school clients, and in this particular man, he was a good man. He worked hard. He tried to give me what I needed, but his entire career had been built on metal ceramics. He was what I called a PFM cutting machine, and I didn't mean that as a slam. It was actually respect that he actually deserved because, many of those clients, they had a system and it just worked. But he called me one day. He wanted to talk about a case that he was going to be doing. It was a younger woman who was going to have a full smile makeover, and he had heard about e.max and he wanted to try it. He was excited, and I didn't want to let him down. So, of course, I told him I could accommodate him. And I believed it when I said I could. What I didn't fully account for was this. Working with this material on single units and working on it with a full aesthetic case, well, they're not the same disciplines. The variables that chameleon effect that actually was smoothing over on single units would maybe get exposed and amplified across a full smile. What the material forgives on one tooth, well, kind of revealed across a full mouth. We went through all the steps, a diagnostic wax up, we made matrices for the temporaries. He prepped them. We made hard temps. The case was planned, and when the preps came in, I can see the first red flag, though I didn't really name it clearly at the time. The reduction wasn't uniform, and this old-school PFM doctor had never needed to worry about this. In metal ceramics, the substructure compensates for everything. The metal underneath gives you the foundation that doesn't depend on precise thicknesses. Yes, we need to have room for the glass, but in pressed glass, ceramic thickness is everything. The optical properties of this material change with the thickness. The way it transmits and diffuses the light changes with thickness. And when you have wildly variable reduction across the arch, some teeth with abundant space, some teeth with almost none, well, you don't have one material on 12 teeth. You have 12 different optical situations wrapped up in the same product. The second red flag was the stump shade. That underlying prep color was all over the place. We had dark teeth. We had posts. We had metal from other restorations bleeding through the preps. And in a single unit, that chameleon effect actually helps you. But across a full smile, each stump shade is fighting the material's optical response in many different directions. And I pressed those crowns, and they were stunning on the bench. That's the cruelest part of the story. The case genuinely looked beautiful. The color was right under the lab light. The characterization was there. The anatomy was there. I packed those cases up with pride. I sent them out believing we had made something amazing. But in the mouth, it was a disaster. I'd chosen the most translucent ingot in this system, the one that performs brilliantly on single units because it lets that natural light of the adjacent dentition come through and anchor in that color. On a variable reduction full arch case, the variable stump shades, the same translucency was broadcasting every inconsistency underneath it. The dark stumps were showing through. The thin areas were behaving differently than the thick areas. Units that had an amazing amount of reduction looked different from the units that didn't. The case was inconsistent in a way that had nothing to do with my pressing technique and everything to do with the inputs I was working from. That appointment was brutal. This doctor had spot etched and he was cutting off these temporaries. Well, it's a super long chair time appointment. And then once you realize that the case isn't going to get delivered, well, you have that brutal realization that you have to retemp the whole thing. That rescheduling, the conversation with a client who actually trusted you. And now he's trying to manage a patient who is sincerely disappointed. So I went back to the lab. I rebuilt that entire case. I chose a lower translucency ingot this time, more for the masking of those really dark stump shades that I had to go over. I went with a lighter shade as well to try to compensate for that darker canvas that was essentially just pulling the value down. I solved that problem in the press, but really I solved it in the rebuild. It wasn't in the initial planning that I actually had it down right. And guys, that was a very expensive lesson, not just financially, though, nobody likes that, but expensive in a relationship, expensive in the trust I had to find a way to earn back, expensive in the sleep that I lost between the failed delivery and the new successful one. And here's the honest thing that I have to say about that case, because that's what really separates a lesson from just a story. I didn't suggest that material. The client asked for it. He had heard about it. He wanted to try it. But here's the thing. I didn't see the red flags clearly enough. And I certainly did not name them. I had enough experience to know that uniform reduction mattered. I had enough experience to know that the stump shade was a variable. I had enough experience to know that my first full arch case with this new material was a different risk profile than my 100th single unit. But guys, I just didn't have enough experience yet to know what questions to ask, know what questions to ask before we got started. And that's really the distinction that this episode is built on. You see, the material did not fail, the diagnosis failed. And the diagnosis, well, it was kind of mine to make. So I want to step back for a moment and give you the context that makes that story make a little more sense. That e.max case didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a very specific moment in the evolution of this trade. And understanding that evolution is understanding why every generation of technician will face that same fundamental mistake. For most of my career, the king of the crown was the PFM. Porcelain fused to metal ceramics, whatever name you know it by, it just really dominated our industry. For decades, it was the only thing that was viable. And let's be clear about something, because I hear people talk about PFMs like they escaped this horrible time in the industry. And guys, it wasn't a limitation. It was a solution that worked. The reason the PFM was king for so long is simple. It was super versatile. It had high clinical success rates across enormous ranges of conditions. And the part nobody says out loud, the window to success was wide, even when poor clinical judgment was being implemented. The metal substructures and PFMs forgive more than all ceramics could ever do. It compensates for variable reduction. It provides a foundation that doesn't depend on the optical precision. It tolerates horrible bonding because it's living in the cementation style world. It hides that underlying stump shade and the problems that metal can hide. The window was super wide with this product, and it worked. That wide window is not a criticism for the material. It's exactly why it worked, and it's exactly why clinicians who built their entire career on PFM preps were really unprepared. And not really for any fault of their own, but for this more narrow, more demanding world of all ceramic restorations that were just coming in. Then came this aesthetic revolution. Empress first. That pressable glass that increased strength and improved speed and elevated cosmetics almost overnight. The guys that were doing feldspatic restorations back in the day in that era, were working at roughly a 60 to 90 megapascals of flexural strength when it came to the glass, and Empress came in somewhere around 160 to 180 or whatever it was. It was a super meaningful jump. The hardest part about this is when e.max arrived, lithium disilicate was probably another 360 to 400 megapascals. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was another huge jump for an all-ceramic. And that strength gave us more versatility, more indications. When the use of it in the posterior, it started to be, is this really indicated for this? Full coverage in situations that pressed ceramics never had occupied before. But with every increase in the aesthetic performance came an increase in the sensitivity to the variables underneath it. The more beautiful the material, the more it was influenced by the thickness, by the underlying color, by the canvas the clinician prepared. The optical properties that made e.max look alive in the mouth were the same properties that made it look unforgiving on imperfect inputs. And then zirconia arrived and it changed everything again, but in a different direction. Zirconia in those days, brutally strong, much like today, but those initial iterations were so strong that the aesthetics were so significantly compromised. It just looked opaque. It looked dead. But it was nearly unbreakable and it was cementable, so no bonding protocol was required, which saved chair time. It eliminated another variable, and the PFM guys loved it because it handled very similar to what they were used to. The labs preferred it because it was easier and less expensive to produce. It actually did erode the market for e.max for a while and forced the manufacturers to actually find a way to substantiate the strength that could be achieved with bonding over cementation. And coincidentally, it arrived right around the time that zirconia was taking their market share. But it's true. It actually was true. And then the new iterations of zirconia started coming around. The high-translucency, multi-layered zirconia, and labs everywhere, myself included, thought that this was going to be the universal answer, the one material to rule them all. And then we quickly found out that high-translucency zirconia often looked low value in the mouth, and we had the same problems that we were initially faced with e.max and other all-ceramics. Different material, same lesson, just different packaging. And so here we are today. Today we have this enormous range of materials. All kinds of different formulations of zirconia. Lithium disilicate is still strong. Hybrid ceramics, monolithic options in these multi-layer systems. We have manufacturers promising the next iteration of the material will finally tick all the boxes. Strong, beautiful, versatile, one disc for everything. Aesthetics and bulletproofness. That grail material. And I want to say something honest about that promise. It's not wrong. The science is real. The materials are genuinely improving, but the grail material, the one that is strong enough and beautiful enough that diagnosis becomes optional, well, that material changes something fundamentally about this trade, our trade. I think our trade is what I would say one material away from extinction. I don't mean that in the revenue going away. I mean the number of restorations produced is growing. We know this. What I mean is this. When the skill required to produce an acceptable restoration becomes a point and click, when the material is strong enough and the process streamlined enough and the production becomes material-driven rather than skill-driven, the technician becomes a machinist. And when additive manufacturing arrives deeper than it is today and the material evolves to be strong and aesthetic, well, now any office can produce it without having training. All they have to do is open their checkbook. And guys, we've already seen that. The beginning of that story is here now. And what we have to gravitate to hold on to is the fact that the in-house labs that used to just be a hobby for someone who loved the craft, well, today, our manufacturers have turned anyone into a machinist nearly overnight. And when the materials evolve to make the path not just viable, but maybe optimal for the most indications, in-office is then going to take away the segment of our trade that is our gravy. Well, what's going to remain for us? I believe what remains is the diagnosis. What remains is the case where maybe the material selection requires a human being who has seen enough failures to know what to ask for. Maybe the full arch restorations, those compromised surgical outcomes, those patients that just kill every restoration. The clinician whose prep has maybe contraindicated for the material that they prescribed. Well, guys, that's where I live. That's where I choose to position myself. And it wasn't accidentally. It was strategic. When I moved away from quadrant dentistry towards comprehensive treatment and implant prosthetics, well, there was a reason for it. I saw early that singles and short span bridges were a commodity. And that race to the bottom on quadrant pricing was a race I didn't want to enter. My relevance depends on the complexity that cannot be automated. Yet, the judgment that the software doesn't have, the diagnosis that the menu cannot just perform. And that diagnosis, I believe, starts with material selection. So let's pull the lesson out of this history and this story that I shared with you and give you a principle that runs underneath all of it. I think that a material is not chosen from a menu. It's chosen from a diagnosis. And the diagnosis is not just the case. The diagnosis is the case plus the clinician. Well, what do I mean by that? And, the second part is something that maybe nobody has ever really spoke about openly, but I'm going to name it plainly today because it's the most honest thing I can tell you about material selection. Your client is a variable. Their prep design is a variable. Their bonding protocol or absence of one is a variable. Their clinical habits and the way they've always done things. The patterns that you've learned from working with them over the months or years. All of it goes into a diagnosis before you select a material. That old school PFM doctor I was telling you about in that e.max smile over makeover case? He was a skilled clinician. He was very good at what he did. But he was very used to a material environment that, he was confident in. And he moved into a new material that had a new environment. And his preps were designed for metal substructures. His margins were designed for the forgiveness that metal provides. His experience was in a world where the window to success was wide enough that variable reduction and imperfect inputs were manageable. e.max wasn't in that world initially. All ceramic is not in that world. And my job? The job I failed to do adequately on that first full arch case was to actually understand that his clinical execution was a variable in my material selection. It's not to judge him, not to lecture him, but to factor him into the diagnosis in the same way I factor the stump shade and the reduction and the occlusal situations I have to deal with. Knowing your clients as a variable. That's not something you learn on day one. It comes from the reps, from knowing a client's fingerprints, where they are excellent at, and where maybe they need a little guidance, where their patterns will create challenges downstream, from understanding that the prescription on the lab slip is a starting point for the conversation, not the end of it. And here is the business truth underneath the principle. In this trade right now, the fee-for-service clinician who wants a true laboratory partner is a smaller segment than it was 10 years ago. In-office milling is taking work. Insurance pressures is compressing margins. The commodity side is accelerating. You cannot win this commodity competition, guys. So the question is not, how do I make this material work? The question is, why should they choose me? The answer is your diagnosis. The answer is the call you make before they cut a tooth. The answer is the conversation where you look through the prescription and into the actual situation and say, doctor, before we commit to a material, I need to understand a few things about the case. That conversation is not difficult, but the alternative is the case that comes back. And the case that comes back is always more expensive than the conversation that prevented it. Let me give you the practical version. The things I actually look for when I'm evaluating whether material selection is appropriate for what the case actually requires. These are not rules, they are questions, and the wisdom is not knowing the answers, it's maybe knowing what to ask. Where is this restoration of the mouth? And how much room do we have to work with? And is the reduction uniform? The more aesthetic the material, the more its optical properties are enslaved to dimension. High-translucency ceramic at 1.5 millimeters is going to behave differently than the same material at, say, 0.3. The way it transmits light, the way it diffuses the color from the underlying structure, the way it reads in the mouth under natural lighting. When reduction is varied across the full arch, Well, you don't have one material making one aesthetic statement. You have 12 different optical situations that you're trying to harmonize into a single smile. With PFM, it tolerates this. The metal substructure compensates for it. An all ceramic system does not. What you build in the lab is what the patient wears. The canvas matters. The biggest, most influential part for all ceramics is always going to be the underlying tooth color, that stump shade. What does the prep look like after all the existing restorative material may have been removed? Is there an old metal post in there? Is the dentin dark? Is it a root canal treated tooth? All of these things are going to influence that canvas. So I want photographs, not just a shade tab under fluorescent light. For high aesthetic cases, I need the face and a smile for contacts. Retracted for clarity. Close up the tab in the same plane as the prep, and specifically photos showing the stump shade. The more translucent the material, the more the underlying canvas controls the outcome. You're not just painting on a white wall, you're actually painting on whatever the prep presents. So here's the truth. I just named two things that most technicians may really consider. I think all technicians do, but there's two more important things that I think go unnoticed. And we're not just talking about preps, we're talking about the entire situation. Like, what is the adjacent teeth doing? What is the opposing arch? Is there super-erupted teeth creating a functional situation that maybe a more aesthetic material couldn't survive? Are there large alloy restorations adjacent to the new restoration that will influence the shade and the optics of whatever we put next to them? I want to see the entire picture. And here's the honest frustration that I'll name plainly. It's been the same for years. For years. And it continues today more than it should. Back in the day, it was triple trays, right? PVS impression material was expensive, especially when they took 6 because they couldn't get the damn margin. Today, with scanning, we're still getting half an arch. We're still getting a quad. There's no cost to that. The barrier is not the technology. The barrier is the habit. The best clients I've worked with do not see single units as just a single unit. They see it as an opportunity to understand the full picture. And guys, that's a habit. Seeing the whole mouth, not just the prescription, something the lab can encourage, case by case, conversation by conversation. And the fourth metric is probably one that you've never discussed. When was the last time you asked a client, hey, are you going to bond this case or are you planning to cement it? Guys, that's not a small variable. The strength of all ceramic materials is significantly enhanced by adhesive bonding. Guys, it's documented in the literature and it's observable in real-world outcomes. A lithium disilicate crown that's properly bonded, it performs differently than the same crown seated with conventional cement. The bond strength, the fracture resistance, the marginal seal, all of this is influenced by how the restoration is seated. Not every practice bonds with the same discipline. Guys, some clinicians, particularly those who've built their careers on PFMs, are not comfortable with full adhesive protocols. Sounds silly in this day and age, but it's true. Guys, that's not a character flaw. It's just a clinical pattern that belongs in my diagnosis. If I know how a client preps normally, I can then have the conversation about whether their typical preparation design is contraindicated from the material they're actually considering on using. And if I can spin that naturally into, hey, are you planning to bond or cement? Well, that's not an interrogation. It's maybe as a partnership, as the lab trying to set the case up for success before a single tooth is ever touched. The fifth metric, and one that is super important, is what I call the patient's history. What has failed in this mouth before and why? If this patient has been on their third restoration on that tooth, I want to know. If this patient is what I call a bond villain, someone whose bite, habits, and parafunctional patterns have been eating restorations for years, well, that history belongs in my material selection. More information is never a bad thing. It sounds simple, and it is. But the resistance to gathering more information is everywhere in this trade. It feels like it's going to slow things down. It feels like it creates friction. Maybe it feels like you're overstepping. It is none of those things, guys. It's a diagnosis. And the diagnosis is not optional if the outcome is going to be repeatable. Here's the practical framework that I promise you in each of these episodes. This is the one thing you'd take back and implement in your laboratory tomorrow and get it working. I call it the material conversation. It's a structured way of ensuring that the material selection happens after the diagnosis, not before it. It's not a checklist you run silently and never share. It's a meaningful conversation with your client. It starts with 5 questions. Guys, it's not demanded, it's not an interrogation, but it's asked with ownership and with a genuine investment in the outcome. Question 1, what does the reduction look like, and is it uniform? Guys, if you have digital files, you often can answer this for yourself before you even make the call. Today's digital workflows give us the ability to cross-section the design virtually, to map the dimensional relationships, and identify the areas where reduction is adequate and areas where it isn't. That cross-section is one of the most powerful communication tools available to the modern dental laboratory. When you can show the clinician exactly where the material has what it needs and where it doesn't, visually and in a file before a single unit is pressed or milled, well, the conversation stops being your opinion versus theirs. It becomes a shared observation, and a shared observation is the foundation of a shared decision. So question 2 is always going to be about the stump shade. What's that situation, and do I have adequate photo documentation? Guys, you do not have to have a DSLR camera to get excellent photos. You just have to understand how to utilize the most powerful tool in your pocket, that phone. For high aesthetic cases, that shade information from a single tab is the base minimum. I need photographs. I need good photographs. However you take them, DSLR or iPhone, I don't care. Just get me good, repeatable photos. And specifically, photos that show me the stump shade. There's nothing worse than not knowing what that canvas that I'm building on actually looks like. And guys, if the documentation isn't there, ask for it. Not as a demand, but as a service. Question 3 is the first thing I look for is, is it a complete scan? What does that full arch look like? This might sound crazy to you, but even for single units, even on short span bridges, I want to understand the functional environment. If a full arch scan isn't available, I ask why not. I try to push them to think differently. I explain why it matters, not because I want to be difficult, but because what I see in the full arch changes what I select and how I build. So question 4, what is your delivery protocol? Are you going to bond or cement? And if the answer is cement, is the prescribed material the right choice given what we discussed about reduction and stump shade? This question, if done right, doesn't feel like a test. It feels like the lab is actually reaching out, doing its job better than the competition. And the clinician who's been asked this question enough times starts to anticipate it. They start sending cases with the protocol already noted because they know you're going to ask this. Guys, that's the relationship shifting. That's the lab becoming more than just a vendor. So let's talk about the call structure. I think it can sound like this. Doctor, I'm on your side and I want to make sure that we set this case up for the best possible outcome. Before I commit to the material, I want you to walk you through a few things I'm seeing. Here's what I'm looking at. And then you go through the specific variables one at a time, without accusation, without performance. Guys, you're not auditing the clinician, you're actually just protecting the case. Then you offer options. Because the goal is not to override the clinician's preference, the goal is to make the decision informed. And sometimes after that conversation, the clinician still wants that original material, and that's fine. Because now they understand the variables and they have to own their own choice. Guys, that's way different than the situation when the clinician who prescribed the material without knowing what they actually were committing to. Sometimes after those conversations, the clinician changes course. They choose a stronger material. They adjust the prep. They schedule a new record appointment to get you what you need. And that's when the conversation is working exactly as intended. And sometimes that conversation actually will reveal that the case is way more compromised than the prescription ever suggested. Those conversations, those are the conversations that earn trust. Not immediately, but maybe they can feel a little uncomfortable in the moment, but I'm telling you, clinicians who get that honest call from the lab early, who avoid disaster because someone actually spoke up, well, they remember that. They call you back. They send the harder cases to you because they know you're looking at them differently than anyone else. Guys, that's not marketing. That's the only sustainable advantage an independent laboratory has in the market that's consolidating around you. My relevance in this trade, the reason I get the cases I get, the reason clinicians call me before they cut the tooth, it's not my software, it's not my mill, it's not the materials I have access to. I like the thing. It's because I look through the prescription to the actual situation. I evaluate the case plus the clinician. I run the diagnosis before I run the mill. And guys, I've been wrong enough times, those expensive, humbling relationship testing times, to know what questions to ask before I commit to a material. You see, every restoration is a one-off, and past performance is not indicative of future results. The case that looked exactly like this one and succeeded does not guarantee that this one will. The variables change, the clinician changes, the patient changes, the canvas will always change. But you can make correlations based on known variables. And the unknown or unshared information, the reduction the client didn't think to mention, the stump shade that wasn't documented, the bonding protocol that was assumed rather than confirmed. That is where cases die. Not in the fabrication, but in the diagnosis that was skipped. More information is never a bad thing. The call is always cheaper than the failure. And maybe knowing your client as a variable is the most honest, most useful, most underutilized skill in this trade. Stop selecting materials from a menu. Start selecting materials from a diagnosis. The 5 questions I gave you today are not a checklist to run in silence. They're a conversation to have with the clinician every time on every significant case until that conversation becomes the expectation, until it becomes the standard, until it becomes the thing that separates you from the portal and the in-house mill, and the next iteration of whatever the industry is promising will make your judgment irrelevant. Because the judgment, it's not irrelevant, not yet. Not for the complex cases, not for the full arch reconstructions, not for the compromised surgical outcomes, not for the patients whose history and biology and habits require maybe a human being who has actually seen enough failures to ask the right questions. And guys, that human being is you. Act like it. Protect your margins. Protect your meaning. Thank you for listening to episode 16 of Margins and Meaning. If this show has value to you, share it with one technician or one clinician who still cares about doing things the right way. This has been John Wilson for Margins and Meaning. I thank you. And until next time, I say, take care.